Hello and welcome to another edition of NASA Grants Training. I'm Christiane Diallo, a Senior Program Analyst with the NASA Office of Procurement, Grants Policy and Compliance. The focus of this training is an introduction to single audits and how NASA grant recipients can ensure compliance and accountability. By the end of this training, you will gain an understanding of key concepts and practices related to single audits, including an understanding of what single audits are and the regulatory requirements that govern them, an explanation of the single audit process and the roles and responsibilities for federal agencies, grant recipients, and auditors, an understanding of how single audits apply to NASA grants programs, the ability to describe and differentiate the various elements that make up a single audit report, and lastly, you will be able to identify some of the best practices to promote compliance and also minimize the occurrence of single audit findings. So what is a single audit? It is an independent examination of an organization's financial statements and federal award program to ensure that the organization is compliant with federal statutes, regulations, and the award terms and conditions. The Single Audit Act is the legislation that established the foundation for single audits. It introduced requirements for audits of entities such as states, local governments, and Indian tribal governments that administer federal financial assistance programs. OMB issued circulars A128 and A133 to implement the Single Audit Act. These circulars extended to audit requirements to institutions of higher education and other nonprofit organizations. On December 26, 2013, OMB issued 2 CFR Part 200, which superseded the OMB circulars related to single audits and implemented additional changes, including increasing the audit threshold from $500,000 to $750,000. The 2 CFR also mandated federal agencies to obtain single audit reports from the Federal Audit Clearinghouse instead of directly from the recipients, which ultimately reduced the administrative burden that was placed on smaller entities. The audit requirement, as well as the roles and responsibilities for the key players that are involved in the single audit process, are outlined in subpart F of the 2 CFR, and I'll be going over those sections in the next few slides. It is a requirement that non-federal entities that expend more than $750,000 in federal award funds during their fiscal year have a single audit or a program-specific audit performed for that year. Non-federal entities may opt for a program-specific audit if they only have one federal program, or if their funding is received from one federal agency and the laws and regulations, terms and conditions do not require a financial statement. This requirement does not apply to NASA grantees unless all the federal funds are issued by NASA and the audit is approved in advance by NASA. Recipients that do expend less than $750,000 during their fiscal years are not required to obtain a single audit. However, they must make their records available for review or audit by the appropriate officials. One thing that I want to highlight here is that in the upcoming revisions of the 2 CFR, OMB is planning to raise the threshold for single audit requirements from $750,000 to $1 million. Although this is going to reduce the burden that is placed on the smaller entities, it also means that entities may see an increase in monitoring from their federal funding agencies. Another requirement is that audits must be conducted annually unless the non-federal entity is required by the Constitution or state regulations to undergo audits less frequently. And for those entities who fail to comply with the single audit requirements, they may face potential consequences as it is outlined in the 2 CFR 200, Section 339. These consequences, as highlighted here, include temporarily withholding cash payment, wholly or partly suspending or terminating the awards, or initiating suspension or debarment proceedings. Auditees play a crucial role in ensuring transparency and accountability throughout the audit process. They are responsible for procuring audit services, which involve selecting and hiring qualified auditors to conduct the single audits, and costs for which are allowable and may be charged to the award. They must prepare the financial statements, including the schedule of expenditures, a federal award, and provide auditors with the supporting documentation as requested. They are responsible for following up on all audit findings and taking corrective actions as necessary. Finally, auditees must ensure that the audit report is submitted in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and the submission is typically due within 30 calendar days after receiving the report or within 9 months after the end of the audit period. As for the auditor's responsibilities, they are responsible for conducting audits in accordance with generally accepted government auditing standards, commonly referred to as GAGAs. These standards are the bedrock of audit quality in ensuring that audit procedures meet the highest professional and ethical standards. Auditors are responsible for determining whether the financial statements and the schedule of expenditures of federal awards are presented fairly. This means that they're assessing whether financial information accurately represents the entity's financial position, including federal awards that they have received. The auditors do perform internal controls testing to verify whether systems and processes are in place to safeguard assets, maintain data integrity, and also ensure compliance. Finally, the auditors are assessing the entity's compliance with the federal program requirements outlined in the compliance supplement. This means that they're verifying whether the entity adheres to federal regulations, policies, and guidelines pertaining to the management and utilization of federal funds. All federal agencies that issue federal awards must comply with the responsibilities that are outlined in Section 513 of 2 CFR 200. Other responsibilities vary depending on whether an agency has cognizance or oversight responsibilities. A cognizant agency is the agency that provides most funding to a recipient that expends more than $50 million in federal funding annually during a 5-year period. Agency with oversight responsibilities are the agency that provide the most amount of direct funding to a recipient that is not assigned a cognizant agency in that entity's fiscal year. As of fiscal year 2023, NASA serves as the cognizant agency for 5 recipients and oversight for 17 recipients. Entities may refer to their schedule of expenditures, also known as the CFA, to determine their assigned cognizant or oversight agency based on the total amount of direct funding. NASA's responsibilities as cognizant and oversight agency includes providing technical assistance, advice, and assistance to auditees and auditors, obtaining or conducting quality control reviews on selected audits that are made by non-federal auditors, and providing the results of those audits to interested organizations. They are responsible for advising the auditee of any deficiencies that are found in the audits when the deficiencies require corrective actions by the auditor, and also providing technical advice to auditees and auditors upon request. In addition to the cognizant and oversight responsibilities, NASA is responsible for ensuring that audits are completed and that the single audit reports are submitted timely in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. We're also responsible for following up on audit findings to ensure that the recipients are taking corrective action plans and timely resolving their findings. This graphic outlines a high-level overview of the single audit process. It starts with NASA issuing the award to the recipient and then updating the compliance supplement, which I'll get into in the next slide. Next, the recipient spends the funds in accordance with established regulations and the award's terms and conditions. It is then followed by the recipients preparing for the single audits. In this step, the recipient prepared the appropriate financial statements, including the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, and they also provide the auditor with access to all the necessary documents that are required to perform the audit. The external auditor performed the audit in the 4th step and then issue a report that includes the scope and results of the audit as well as the recipient's corrective action plan. The last step in the process involves NASA reviewing the audit report and ensuring timely resolution of audit findings. As mentioned in the previous slide, one of the agency's responsibilities in a single audit process is to annually update the compliance supplement. And in case you're not familiar with the compliance supplement, it is a document that provides guidance to auditors in evaluating whether an entity is compliant with federal program requirements. The compliance supplement is organized into 8 parts. Part 1 provides essential background information on the compliance supplement. Part 2 contains a matrix of compliance requirements that serves as a roadmap for auditors. Part 3 is the most critical section of the compliance supplement and provides detailed information on the specific compliance requirements for each federal program. Part 4 focuses on agency-specific requirements and provides auditors with additional guidance and context that is specific to the federal awarding agency responsible for the program. Part 5 is the clusters of program, which groups together programs that have similar compliance requirements and therefore streamlines the audit process. The compliance requirements for NASA programs and other research funding agencies are found in Part 5 of the supplement. So if you are a recipient of NASA funding, you should refer to Part 5 to access a comprehensive list of compliance requirements that is applicable to your funding. Part 6 addresses the objectives, principles, and components of internal controls. Part 7 provides guidance for auditing programs that are not included in Parts 4 or 5. And Part 8 includes a list of appendices. I've provided a link of the 2023 supplement here for your reference, but also please note that the 2024 compliance supplement is currently undergoing updates and is also set to release sometime in May of next year. This table highlights the requirements for the research and development cluster, which NASA falls under. These are the requirements that if your entity fails to comply with, it may have a direct and material effect on the program. And in order to reduce burden and only focus on those requirements that are likely to result in fraud, waste, and abuse, agencies must limit the number of compliance requirements that are subject to audit to 6, except for the research and development cluster, which may identify 7 requirements. So this table lists the list of compliance requirements that are subject to NASA programs. And the second column there provides you the objective that the auditors are testing. So for the first requirement, which is your activities, costs, allowed and unallowed, the auditors are verifying whether or not the federal awards were expended only for the allowable activities as it is outlined in the project. As for the cash management requirement, they are ensuring that the cash disbursements are made in accordance with federal regulations, the terms and conditions of the grants, or applicable cost principles. The equipment and real property management, the auditors are testing whether your entity maintains proper records for equipment and adequately safeguarding and maintaining the equipment. As for the period of performance, the auditors are testing whether your entity charged federal award for allowable costs that were incurred during the period of performance, or whether or not the costs were incurred prior to the date the federal award was made that were authorized by the federal awarding agency or the pass-through entity. For the procurement and suspension and debarment, the auditors are testing whether procurements under federal awards were made in compliance with applicable federal regulations and other procurement requirements that are specific to the award or the subaward. For the subaward subrecipient monitoring, they're testing whether or not the grant recipients have properly monitored and oversee recipients to ensure that they're compliant with federal requirements when the subawards are made. And as far as the special tests and provisions, the auditors are testing whether the grant recipients are adhering to the special terms and conditions that may be placed into the award. An example of this may be key personnel that are assigned to a specific project. The single audit report submission package is the mechanism that is used to communicate the audit results and management's planned actions to the stakeholders. The reporting package includes the data collection form as well as the audit report. The form includes information about the entity, the federal awards for each program, the auditor's summary of financial statement and audit findings. The audit report consists of several required components, that is, the financial statements of the organization and a schedule of federal awards showing the total expenditures for each program, the auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting, and internal controls over compliance for major programs, the auditor's schedule of current findings and question costs. Findings are issued specifically to financial statement or compliance. Financial statement findings are related to deficiencies in accounting controls, And these findings highlight weaknesses in the organization internal control process, such as an error in their financial reporting or weaknesses in the financial management practices. The compliance findings, on the other hand, are related to noncompliance with federal laws, statutes, and regulations, as well as the program terms and conditions. These findings are specific to individual compliance issues within each of the major programs. They indicate instances where federal funds were not used in accordance with the program requirements. And the last component of the audit reports are the summary schedule of prior audit findings and the status of those findings if applicable. The 2 CFR 200 requires auditors to present findings with specific details. The elements of an audit findings include the condition, which is the situation where there is noncompliance with the requirements that would warrant attention. In other words, what did the auditors find? The second element is the criteria, which is usually the laws, regulations, or the terms and condition that is associated to the finding. The third element here is the cause. So we are documenting what caused the finding or how did the finding occurred. And this usually serves as a basis for recommendations for the corrective action. The effect or potential effect is the consequences resulting from the finding. The recommendations are suggested actions that the recipient may take to correct the cause and reduce the likelihood of the finding repeating. The views of responsible officials and planned corrective actions is a statement as to whether the officials concur with the findings. And finally, the auditors must identify whether or not the finding has question costs. And these costs are costs that the auditor or the oversight agency has identified as potentially ineligible, unallowable, or does not have supporting documentation. As mentioned earlier, entities are responsible for submitting the audit reporting package to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse within 30 days after receipt of the auditor's report or no later than 9 months after the end of the audit period. For example, if your entity's fiscal year ends on September 30th, 2023, then your single audit report must be submitted into the Federal Audit Clearinghouse no later than June 30th, 2024. The Federal Audit Clearinghouse, in case you're not familiar with this website, it serves as a central repository for the collection, processing, and dissemination of audit reports, and also operates under the oversight of the Office of Management and Budget. The current clearinghouse is managed by the U.S. Census Bureau. However, effective October 1, 2023, that responsibility will transition to the General Services Administration. Following this transition, all fiscal year 2023 audits will be submitted through the new Federal Audit Clearinghouse. This graphic outlines NASA's single audit monitoring and resolution process. The process begins with NASA conducting a search in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse for single audit submissions. For missing audits with expenditures that are over $750,000, NASA follows up with the recipients to ensure that the audits are submitted. Audit reports with NASA findings are assessed for adequacy, followed by issuance of a management decision letter. All management decision letters that are issued by NASA include a summary of the findings, a statement of whether or not NASA agrees with the proposed corrective action plans, a statement of whether the monetary findings, in this case the question calls, were disallowed, and if so, the reasons for that, a timetable for the corrective action plan implementation if it is not already included in the report or completed. And lastly, NASA's appeals process. Per the 2 CFR 200, NASA must issue all MDLs no later than 6 months after the single audit reports are accepted in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Listed on this slide are some common audit findings and corrective actions, best practices for recipients' considerations. It is important to note that corrective actions should be tailored to address the specific findings and the compliance issues that are identified in the audit report and should also be consistent with the federal regulations and the grant's terms and conditions. Additionally, entities should maintain documentation to demonstrate their compliance efforts and the effectiveness of the corrective actions that are taken. The first common audit finding that we see within our single audit reports are related to allowable cost or cost principles. This normally occurs when the expenditures do not have adequate supporting documentation, or when the auditors identify specific unallowable costs, such as alcohol or entertainment, or when the cost cannot be traced to a project or is outside of the period of performance. An acceptable corrective action for this type of finding would be for the recipient to maintain supporting documentation with an explanation and adequate source substantiating that the question costs were allowable. The second will be for the recipient to establish policies and procedures that costs be supported by adequate source documentation, and also specifying within that policy that only applicable and allowable costs be charged to an award. The second type of finding is related to equipment and real property, and this normally occurs when the physical inventory are not performed timely or properly. An acceptable corrective action plan for this type of finding would be for the recipient to review and update their internal policies and procedures that is related to equipment and real property to align with the federal regulations and grant requirements. Secondly, the recipient can provide training to their staff who are responsible for equipment and real property management to ensure that they are knowledgeable about federal regulations and grant requirements. The third common finding is the finding related to subrecipient monitoring, and this normally occurs when the subrecipient activities are not properly monitored. And the acceptable corrective action plan here will be for the recipient to develop or enhance their risk assessment process so that they may be able to identify high-risk subrecipients. The recipient should also consider criteria such as the financial stability, prior audit findings, and programmatic complexity within their risk assessment process. Secondly, the recipient should establish a comprehensive monitoring plan for subrecipients, and that plan should outline the frequency and the nature of monitoring the activities, including site visit, desk reviews, and data analysis. And the last common audit finding that we have here is the finding that is related to procurement suspension and debarment. This normally occurs when there are no supporting documentation maintained that is related to procurement activities. There are no supervisory review or approval of purchases that includes credit card or purchases. There are no cost or pricing data for sole source justification maintained, and the system for award management are not checked on whether a vendor has been suspended or debarred. And the acceptable corrective actions for this type of finding would be for the recipient to maintain supporting documentation for all of their procurement actions, and also establish policies and procedures that all purchases be supported by adequate source documentation, such as the purchase order, sole source justification, and cost and pricing data. To wrap up this training, here are some strategies that NASA recipients may adopt to maintain compliance and also minimize the occurrence of single audit findings. The first is guidance and training. It is very important to provide clear guidance and training to the recipient staff on federal regulations, reporting requirements, and compliance expectations. Second is transparency and communication. It is important for the recipient to maintain an open line of communication with NASA and also seek clarification on federal requirements and reporting procedures. Third is the policies and procedures. It is very important to develop and maintain a clear, comprehensive policies and procedures that is in alignment with the federal regulations and the grant requirements, and also ensure that staff members are aware of these policies and procedures. Fourth is to ensure an effective internal control. Internal controls are important as it prevents error, fraud, and noncompliance. It is also known that a well-designed internal control can help maintain financial accuracy and also ensure that the grant funds are used appropriately. And last on our list is document retention. As we've learned earlier, some of the common audit findings that we see are related to question costs, and that sometimes occur when the recipient does not have adequate supporting documentation on file. So it is very important to maintain a comprehensive records of all grant-related transactions that include financial, programmatic documentation, and correspondence. as effective documentation can also support compliance verification. Thank you for tuning into the introduction of single audits. I hope you enjoyed the training. If you have any questions or comments related to the topics that I've covered today, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is on this slide for your reference. And also, if you have any general questions related to NAFSA grants, please feel free to visit our grants policy and compliance website using the URL on this slide as well. Thank you.